I want to ask you, what's happening in Darfur in Sudan?
However we analyze it, it's important to realize just how deep, how pervasive, how traumatic the human story of suffering is in Al Fasher today. So let's look at the United Arab Emirates, which is the key actor here. It is the single biggest investor in Africa at the moment, and by far the biggest investor in the Horn of Africa. Although it denies it, it is backing the Rapid Support Forces. It has made it possible for Hemeti to wage this war. So what is the nature of that relationship?
I mean, what are the drivers? Is it ideology? Is it public or external interventions? What are the drivers?
It's very tempting to see Sudan as a contest between autocracy and democracy.
Oh, yeah.
But that doesn't work.
It doesn't work at all.
Doesn't work at all. So he saw his task as getting the price right for buying everybody. And the market at that time was highly deregulated. It was a free-for-all. So virtually anyone with a couple of land cruisers, a handful of soldiers, a couple of heavy weapons, a dozen Kalashnikovs could set themselves up as a political business, make some raids, make a mark on the political landscape. The globalization was dissolving most of the attributes of sovereignty. Financial sovereignty, military sovereignty really was never a very meaningful concept for a state like the UAE. And I think it's interesting to look into the UAE's own history here, because it is a very unique history, or actually perhaps less unique than we think, but a very revealing, extreme example of a particular kind of history. And those political scientists and IR scholars and journalists who think that this is all about failed states, or it's all about democracy versus dictatorship,
Good day and welcome to another episode of Metamorphosis with Hamed Al Ghaithi. Today we're privileged to host a distinguished guest, Professor Alex de Waal. He is foremost authority on Africa and African conflicts, and he covered for a long time lots of issues on Africa, like famine, civil wars, and atrocities. Professor de Waal is the executive director of World Peace Foundation, and he's a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's a thinker, scholar on conflicts in Africa. He wrote several distinguished books, like Famine That Kills to Mass Starvation. And he devised a very important theory to understand African conflicts. It's called the political marketplace. It's an honor to have you today.
Good to be with you. It's unfortunate that we are speaking at a time when some of the most horrific examples of what conflict in Africa means are unfolding as we speak.
And I think that's why our conversation today is quite timely. So I want to ask you, what's happening in Darfur in Sudan?
So what is happening is things are happening at different levels. And the core human story is quite horrific. However we analyze it, it's important to realize just how deep, how pervasive, how traumatic the human story of suffering is in Al Fasher today. It's been a war for 2.5 years in Darfur. There's been a siege of Al Fasher for over 1.5 years. It's been a starvation siege. Famine conditions have been present for well over a year, afflicting that population. The rapid support forces headed by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, have been besieging al-Fasher. They've been killing people who try and escape, or ransoming them, getting them to pay. And if they can't pay, then they will kill them. They have been using artillery, they've been using drones to attack civilian targets, including hospitals. And when they overrun parts of the city or displace camps, they will massacre civilians, they will destroy the health infrastructure. And when the city fell on the 26th of last month, what we're seeing unfolding is frankly, a genocidal massacre that had been foretold for many months and which had not been prevented, had simply been allowed to unfold. So that is the basic human reality from which we cannot escape.
And these genocides, is it done against ethnic groups? Is it against political opponents? Against whom?
So I've been working in Sudan, or in and on Sudan, for over 40 years, and have been closely observing how wars, and especially counterinsurgency, is conducted. First of all, in the south of Sudan, by successive governments in Khartoum against insurgents in the south, and then 20 years ago against an insurgency in Darfur. And I used two terms to characterize it 20 years ago. One was counterinsurgency on the cheap. And what I meant by that was that the government would, instead of using its regular forces, it would employ irregular militias drawn from the communities themselves. And it was on the cheap because these men were not paid. And so they would reward themselves with carrying out local vendettas, seizing land, looting goods, taking women and girls as their trophies. And I also called it genocide by force of habit, because the way in which this type of counterinsurgency, this sort of ethics-free zone unfolded, routinely led to these massacres. And 20 years after I gave it that characterization, the only thing that has really changed in Darfur is that the spearhead of the counterinsurgency of 20 years ago, which was an irregular Arab militia called the Janjaweed, has now been formalized as the Rapid Support Forces. And that was done by the government of former President Omar al-Bashir to support his power. But then the Rapid Support Forces under General Hemeti turned against their erstwhile patron sponsor, the Sudan Army. But it's important in all this to not to fall into the trap of assuming that because the immediate violence is inter-ethnic and the targeting is ethnic, and because there are all sorts of ethnic and racial slurs employed by the perpetrators, that it is somehow a primordial opposition, that there is, as it were, a division between these groups that cannot be overcome. Because what we peel back a little bit, and what we find is that on both sides there are armed groups, there are communities, political formations that you would assume, if you were taking an ethnic lens, belonged on the other side. So the Rapid Support Forces is drawn overwhelmingly from Darfur's nomadic Arab groups, but there are Arab groups on the other side.
Of course.
And there are groups within the RSF that are drawn from the very same groups that it is committing violence against. So what is the explanation for this? Because this is a very consistent pattern that we find, that actually wars here are at another level. They are coalitions of convenience, and what stitches them together. And I would argue that it is very much to do with a pattern of political bargaining that I characterize as the political souk, the political market. And this is the language that the operators themselves use.
That's very good. We'll get to the details of this, of the theory the political souk or market. But let's a little bit understand the mechanics of what's happening in Al-Fashir and Sudan. And of course, now that the threat that what happened in Al-Fashir will also happen in other parts of Sudan. Why do we see this conflict in Sudan? I mean, what are the drivers? Is it ideology? Is it public or external interventions? What are the drivers?
So over the decades in Sudan, there have been conflicts over many things. Conflicts over ideology, the Islamists against the secularists, an Arab nationalist ideology against other ideologies. And they're also overlain with issues of identity and ethnicity. But as time has progressed, what we have seen is the disintegration of the institutional form of the state and its replacement by a constant, unending round of very Machiavellian bargaining. So it's very tempting to see Sudan as a contest between autocracy and democracy. But that doesn't work.
It doesn't work at all.
It doesn't work at all. It's very tempting to see it as a war of two sides. And that actually only works at certain moments. It breaks down. It's tempting to see the disorder as nihilism, as making no sense, as anarchy. But actually there is an order, there is a logic to what appears to be disorder. And what I have tried to do in my scholarship is to, and also my practice, because I have been more a practitioner of peacemaking, of humanitarian action, of democracy activism in Sudan than I have been a scholar over the years. What I try to do is to make sense of that disorder. And I find what I found most useful is understanding how this works from the viewpoint of those who are actually in it, who are actually practitioners. So they may say one thing to the external world. They may say they are standing for Islamism or against Islamism, for democracy, against democracy. But actually the way they speak to each other is somewhat different.
How do they do that? So
let me give an example which comes from the peace talks for Darfur that happened 2005, 2006, exactly 20 years ago, where the government of Sudan had a delegation led by one of its most senior political operators, a man called Hamed Al Ghaithi. And so the peace talks were convened by the African Union in a hotel in the Nigerian capital, Abuja. And the formal proceedings in the hotel were interminable and extraordinarily unproductive and dull. There was a square table. The mediators, and I was a part of the mediation team, would sit at, as it were, the top table. On the left would be, our left would be the rebel delegation. On our right would be the government delegation. The other side, at the far end, would be observers from the UN, the United States, Arab League, and so on. And pieces of paper would be passed backwards and forwards, and they would argue over the details of the wording. And this had no relevance to what was actually going on. In the corridors of the hotel and in the suite of rooms occupied by this political operator, Hamed Al Ghaithi, what he was doing was playing the political market. Now, his own language, what he himself would tell me, was he would say, I have been sent here with a political budget, sanduka siyasi, a political basket, money that he had, which he didn't need to account for, usually cash, which he would be able to dispense to purchase the allegiance or the cooperation of all those in the room, including those on his own side. His own side was a coalition, and he needed to keep them on side too. And he called this souk asiyasi, the political bazaar, the political market. And his particular skills were a combination of he had the money and he had the knowledge, he had the information. And when you are buying and selling in a souk, you need to have that information. You really need to know how it works. It's not a transparent political market where everything operates out in the open. And so he saw his task as getting the price right for buying everybody. And the market at that time was highly deregulated. It was a free-for-all. So virtually anyone with a couple of land cruisers, a handful of soldiers, a couple of heavy weapons, a dozen Kalashnikovs could set themselves up as a political business, make some raids, make a mark on the political landscape, and then demand money.
Interesting.
But over time, the idea was to consolidate those. This was the agenda, into a monopoly, not in the sense that Max Weber would define a monopoly as the legal, legitimate, constitutionally constituted monopoly on the use of legitimate violence, but a monopoly more in the sense of a company in a market that is able to control the price and control entry and exit from the market.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And actually, this example brings us to your intellectual work, the souk, or the political market. And this is, for me at least, like coming to this literature, it was enlightening because at least like I was familiar with the concept, which has become very fashionable nowadays, failed state. I mean, but what you propose in this module, is totally different. I mean, it's political market. So, yeah.
So what political scientists tend to want to do is to look for order and to sort of screen out the transactional politics of the everyday as white noise, as what they're not interested in. And what I think it's important to do is in these situations of protracted conflict, where states have never actually managed to establish that sort of sovereign monopoly, to flip that, to say actually what counts is the everyday politics of political survival. So if we can understand how key security operators, heads of state, insurgents and others do their political business, and they think of it as business. Business is politics, politics is business. And we understand how they do that as a practice, then we begin to understand what these states are. And going back to the contemporary politics of Sudan, there's a sort of speak to any Western diplomat, any political commentator, and they try and conceive of the conflict, frame the conflict, and especially frame the solution within the framework of let us restore a conventional, institutionalized sovereign state. And the government of Sudan, or recognized government of Sudan, controls less than half the country, hardly controls the capital, plays that sovereignty card as hard as it can, but it plays it because it is so weak. And if you think about what are the constituent parts of sovereignty, control over territory, control over economy and currency, control over violence, control over foreign policy. Some of them it doesn't have at all, and it only has some of them, like control over foreign policy, insofar as it has been given a seat at the United Nations.
Totally agree.
So then at the moment, there is an attempt by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to get the Arab powers of the region together in what he calls the Quad. The Quad is the four states of the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And the idea is these states, because they are the external power brokers in Sudan, need to come to an agreement on the contours of a ceasefire, humanitarian access, and the political future of the Sudan in order for a peace process to move. And that's correct, because it is these external sponsors that are making possible the war efforts at the scale that they're currently occurring. Now, the war would certainly continue, or could continue, without external sponsorship. But it's only because of the massive weaponry and finance provided by the external actors that the intensity of war that is being conducted at the moment is possible. And what the formally what the US and the others, especially the Egyptians, want to do is to reconstitute a unified sovereign state. They want to avoid having two governments in Sudan. They want to avoid a division of the country, de facto division of the country, as happened in Libya, as happens in Yemen. But the question is, do the Arab sponsors really care about this? So let's look at the United Arab Emirates, which is the key actor here. It is the single biggest investor in Africa at the moment, and by far the biggest investor in the Horn of Africa. Although it denies it, it is backing the Rapid Support Forces. It has made it possible for Hemeti to wage this war. So what is the nature of that relationship? What is the UAE trying to do? And I think it's interesting to look into the UAE's own history here, because it is a very unique history, or actually perhaps less unique than we think, but a very revealing, extreme example of a particular kind of history. So the UAE was, some 200 years ago, just over 200 years ago, it was called by the British, the East India Company, the Pirate Coast. And the reason was that the states, the princedoms of Sharjah and the neighboring polities were troublemakers for British commerce.
Yep.
The people of Sharjah said, we were just doing our commerce, and the East India Company came along. First of all, the Portuguese and the Dutch, and then the East India Company.
By the way, I come from that part of the world. Yeah. Exactly. But, yeah.
And so the East India Company came along and said, we need to control this area. And they bombarded Sharjah. They had landings there, and they essentially created a certain sort of protectorate whereby elements of sovereignty of those tribes were taken by the East India Company, such as maritime protection and foreign relations, and some commercial activities, and some were given to the sheikhs.
Yep.
And then the territorial jurisdiction was also, British love to draw lines on maps. So sovereignty was sliced and diced. There was no unitary sovereignty. And it is those same families that over the next 150 years ruled the Trucial states, or Trucial Ahmad. And then in 1971, they became independent. And they wanted to retain British military protection because they were very vulnerable, and the British actually let them down. But the historic experience of negotiating with a transnational commercial mercenary company, which was ready to slice and dice sovereignty and pocket parts of that, was one that was very much alive in the experience of those ruling families. And they have really replicated that same model. So if you see the UAE in Yemen, in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, in Libya, they are essentially, they don't care too much about boundaries. They don't care too much about unitary sovereignty. What they care about is that they have a relationship of protector to protege with the notables of parts of Yemen, parts of Somalia, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, people in Libya, in Chad, and Hemeti.
But to what end? Why do we have this, relationship? And of course, such actors, including UAE, would invest lots of resources to support and patron these proteges, right? Why do they do that?
So if you think about what has happened in this region, so 20 years ago, this was under the American security umbrella. And then beginning with Obama, and then accelerating under the first Trump administration, that security umbrella was folded and taken away. So Obama left a little bit of a security vacuum. The first Trump administration, its policy for the greater Middle East was to say to its allies, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, this is your backyard. We will allow you to pursue your interests here, and we will back you up as required. And this was a time, of course, when China was becoming more assertive and so on.
So basically the US wouldn't restrain or direct its regional allies' foreign policies. Right?
Precisely. And if you think of it from the point of view of the UAE, here you have a geographically and demographically very small state in a very precarious position when the world is becoming extremely turbulent and, if you like, post-sovereign. So the globalization was dissolving most of the attributes of sovereignty. Financial sovereignty, military sovereignty really never was never a very meaningful concept for a state like the UAE. And so insofar as you have money and you have the idea that in order to survive, your best asset is to utilize your money and your geographical position to protect your interests in the long term, you will want to secure yourself within a sort of post-sovereign order of informal empire. And this in many ways resembles the experience of 200, 250 years ago, when the East India Company would invade India. It would occupy the Gulf, most of the Gulf states, Oman, Yemen,
Sure.
etc. And insofar as the rulers of these states had sovereignty, elements of that sovereignty would be pocketed as part of the transnational commercial portfolio of the East India Company. The jewel in the crown, of course, being the Mughal Empire in Delhi. And then, slightly down the hierarchy, or quite a way, slightly down the hierarchy, you'd have the Sultan of Oman, and then below that you'd have Sharjah and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and
The rest.
and all the rest,
Yep.
all the way as far as Kuwait.
Yep.
And so that is that sort of model of disassembled sovereignty in which those attributes of sovereignty can be priced and traded and indeed bought and sold if you have the resources. That is what we're seeing today. And those political scientists and IR scholars and journalists who think that this is all about failed states or it's all about democracy versus dictatorship are missing the point that actually in the transactional practices that are ongoing in this region, we see a different order, which is historically, as it were, rooted or validated, but also thoroughly modern because it's thoroughly dollarized.
Interesting. But again, I mean, with the East Indian Company that you mentioned, I mean, of course, the stake was for the Brits back then, who was to protect their access to India. So they had to bid for UAE, for Egypt, or Turkey nowadays, and Sudan. What do they want, like, from this miserable, fractured country?
So, within the logic of what I'm describing, they want their clients and they want resources. So there's gold, which is obviously very important, particularly today. There's land, which is both for immediate agriculture, but more in the long term, land banking, because land is scarce. Fertile agricultural land is going to be very valuable. They want strategic real estate on the Red Sea, which is the crossroads of the world. It's in China's Belt and Road. This is the buckle on the belt. There is no belt without the Red Sea. So they all want part of this. And where I think they've been miscalculating is that their interests are understandable and therefore legitimate, but they have allowed the mismanagement of rivalries to allow them to become drawn into a war in Sudan that is not just zero-sum, it's negative-sum. So it is actually not serving anyone's interests. And for me, the big failure of diplomacy over the last 2.5 years since this war broke out is that nobody neither the United States under the Biden administration. Actually, the Trump administration has done better than Biden on Sudan on this time round.
For second term or first term?
Second term. Second term. And the United Nations as well. They just haven't been able to articulate this. They have not analysed the problem properly, or insofar as they have. And there has been good analysis of the crisis in Sudan. They haven't recognised that analysis requires them to take certain steps. And they don't want to take those steps because, let me take the Biden administration as an example. It was clear from the outset that the path to peace in Sudan lay through Cairo, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and then also Doha and Ankara. So you needed to get at least those first three, and preferably all five, on board. In order to do that, you needed the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, or indeed the President, to become involved. You couldn't do it at a more junior level. And you couldn't do it with an Africa diplomat like Molly Fee, the Assistant Secretary for Africa, because no matter how good she was, and she wasn't very good, but even if she had been wonderful, she simply would not have got in through the door in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi.
True.
And the policy of Blinken and Biden was, for Africa, don't bother us. So it was left at Africa level, and of course it failed. And the other element there, which the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, really failed on, and the Biden administration compounded that, was that in order for any move towards a civilian government, dismantling the military kleptocracy that was running the country, and for that to happen, you needed to tackle the pathologies of the political market at source, and that was money. And what the Trump administration, it made two mistakes.
Which are?
So mistake one was that the Saudis and the Emiratis, who at that time, 2019, when the democratic revolution happened in Sudan, when Omar al-Bashir was overthrown and there was a prospect of democracy, the Saudis and the Emiratis came with a $3 billion package to bail out Sudan. But they gave it only to the military. It would have been relatively straightforward for the Trump administration to say, you've put this money on the table and you have free money. These Gulf states have money that they can provide up front. The United States finds it more difficult. At least put that towards the institutions of the central bank and the civilian administration. Don't just give it to the military. And don't withdraw it when your friends in the military are objecting to the way the civilians want to dismantle some of your kleptocratic government businesses. And then the other thing that the Trump administration did, but actually both sides in the US are equally culpable on this, was that in order to get financial normalization of Sudan, US sanctions needed to be lifted. It needed to be taken off the state sponsor of terror list. And both the Democrats and the Republicans said, we will do this when they sign the Abraham Accords, recognize Israel, and they pay compensation to victims of 9/11 and the bombing of the USS Cole, which was a US destroyer that was attacked in Yemen. Even though none of this was done by Sudanese, it was done by Osama bin Laden when he was in Sudan. And even though Sudan had been cooperating with counterterrorism, had been trying to hand over these people, Sudan was the only state party under the sponsor of terror legislation that could be targeted for these payouts. And so they went after Sudan for this. They blatantly used it as a piece of political leverage, and in doing so destroyed the prospects for democracy in Sudan.
Interesting. So, if you talk about the situation now, and if you try to bring this framework, which you laid out on the current development in Sudan, arguably there is no state institutions nowadays in Sudan. It's torn between two warlords. One is called military and one is called, they have two umbrellas, and for outsiders, the one camp is seen as pro-Islamist and the other pro-liberal umbrella, whatever tags. But as you explained, I mean, these tags are very misleading and it's just like political market currency. And having this into account, because these two parties, they are only interested in power and gain. They're not really factoring in any nationalistic cause or humanitarian situation. How can you bring them? I mean, how can you have an outcome, not for the war, but also for the country, for its future?
I think you're absolutely correct here, because for both of them, actually managing a state is a burden on what they can do politically, rather than an asset. And in order for there to be any possibility of a stable institutional political order, whether it's a state or something resembling a state, it requires several factors to be in place. You need to have enough resources to provide public goods. So you need to do it in a stable manner. You need to have taxation, and that can provide that. And in order for that to work, you need to have those men with guns, those political entrepreneurs, those specialists in violence. You need to have an incentive structure such that they don't need to think only short term. At the moment, they're simply like, it's perhaps an inappropriate analogy for a Muslim country, but they're like alcoholics who can only think about the next drink.
Yep.
All they can do is think about how they're going to get through the next few weeks in this incredibly hostile political environment, in which they need money, they need to secure the loyalty of their
militias,
their militias, exactly, their clients, and they need to secure, do some deals with their patrons. And in those circumstances, the rewards for them for sticking with a system of basically plundering the population and milking their patrons, extracting what rents they can from oil or gold or illicit commercial activities, and leaving the burden of providing for the civilian population on a humanitarian community. If it's there, and of course it's falling away at the moment.
And are they allowed to operate?
Yeah. Then they will, that's what they will do. And the temptation of going down that route is so high. And it's so high because the constraints on any viable government, especially the financial fiscal constraints, are so high that it's remarkably difficult for any, I'm not even going to say state building, but state preservation agenda to prevail in Africa today.
Okay, so basically not very bright outlook for the future of Sudan. In your work, because a lot of conflicts in Africa are described on racial or, religious. So, for instance, Darfur was explained as Arabs against African, and South and North of Sudan was explained as Muslim versus Christians. But again, you in your work, you explained that these terms are just another commodity in the political market. So, if we see, having this understanding, is there coherent identity elements in these countries, like in Sudan or in Ethiopia or, Congo, for instance?
So everywhere there is some coherent identity politics, but there's often an illusion. There's a sort of illusion of historical depth or primordialism or cogency and coherence to these ethnic identity labels. And they become more salient and they appear to be stronger in times of violence. There's a feature of violence, which is that those who are experiencing it, and indeed those who are perpetrating it or even witnessing it, assume that from the gravity and the horror of those acts of violence, especially violence against civilians, there must be some deep-seated hatred. Now, it's actually, and it's not necessarily the case. Actually, very often the attributions of these depths and primordial nature of these identities and oppositions occurs as a result of violence rather than the other way around. There's a great ethnography of the fighters, the members of these militias, the junior commanders in Chad by an anthropologist, Marielle Debout. And she makes the observation that for these men, fighting and having enemies is a product of there being generalized war, uncertainty and conflict, rather than the other way around. There's not war because there are enemies because there is war. And in the interwar, when there isn't actually any fighting, men who are on opposite sides, who are often cousins or even sometimes brothers, but often drinking friends, will come together and be very cordial. But at the same time, because you can never fully trust anybody, these are societies that are permeated with anxiety and paranoia. You never know quite when violence may erupt. And so I think it's misleading to read too much into the identity nature of conflict. And let me make two other little remarks about this. One is about the metaphor that is used, deep roots. Now, in fact, if you think about a tree or a plant, a tree will grow roots as it grows. It doesn't start with roots. And this is also the nature of conflict. Conflict grows deeper roots the longer it goes on. When it has just started, it doesn't have deep roots. And the other is a methodological problem that we have in political science and IR, which is the unit of analysis. And very often what you find is that particularly data sets and analytical categories are constituted around groups like identity groups, ethnic groups, which may exist at the end of the war. Doesn't mean they were there at the beginning of the war. But if you take them for granted using what exists at any one point after a war, then by definition you are prejudging what is the cause of that war.
That's true. So basically, I totally agree with you. We try to see not only in Africa, but other places. We tend to see through our conceived frameworks, and most of the times these frameworks are misleading because they are not correct. I want to go back a little bit to have better understanding of conflicts in Africa. Why do we have this model of conflict in play? I mean, when did it start? Was it there since Africa was created by God, or was it there after colonialism, because of colonialism, independence movement? How did it start?
So I think there are two elements to this, and they both have their roots in the colonial era literature on the nature of Africa and the nature of war in Africa. The first is that you problematize the rebellion. You basically, your starting point as an analyst is the problem is the guy who rebels. The problem is not the government that maybe pushes that man or family or community into rebellion. And this is characteristic of colonialism. Of course, colonialism was never going to question itself. It was the opposition to colonialism that was the problem. And so from this, you get the literature on small wars, you get the whole ethos of counterinsurgency. And the counterinsurgency ethos, which was partly to one of concealment and of just how horrible it was, and partly of justifying what counterinsurgency was in order for its practitioners to escape from both the crimes they'd committed and the failures the political failures that they'd been involved in. Because at the end of the day, the only solution to colonial counterinsurgency was to grant independence to those states, which meant by definition the counterinsurgency was problematic from the outset. The other aspect is the categorization of African societies into tribal units, which came about partly as a result of these colonial policies of what they call pacification, a very revealing name in and of itself. And then particularly in the case of the British, indirect rule, the idea that you would appoint chiefs, you would create them as your local despotic representatives. And the wonderful Ugandan scholar Mahmoud Mamdani, whose son is now become even more prominent than him, described in a classic book, Citizen and Subject, how colonial rule actually used this mechanism, and how that was then inherited by post-colonial societies. So that that you had these two problematics which underpinned the political and social science literature. One was the problem is the rebellion, and the second is the problem is the ethnic conflict. And those were both stratagems for denying actually what was usually the major problem, which was the state itself, the colonial state and the state that the colonists handed on to the post-colonial elites. And those states were not designed for, they did not come about through any domestic indigenous processes of political negotiation. They were actually designed in order to benefit an outsider. They were designed on the basis of the most grand corruption you can imagine, which is stealing somebody else's country. As far as corruption then got redefined to mean cheating at a local level. But having stolen someone's country, how do you accuse them of being corrupt if they try and defraud your occupation?
So basically what he's saying is that the state after independence was incapable of ruling, for instance, in the example of Sudan, incapable of ruling vast country like Sudan. I mean, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I read parts of Sudan's history, and it was born with trouble since its inception. I mean, in the 50s, in the east, west, north, south, and troubles didn't stop. But now you're saying that the state itself is born with its disability and did not look in the mirror to reform itself and to recognize the people and their needs.
So all these ships of state, set sail at independence with very explosive cargo. And the question was, would those who had created them, the colonial powers and the United States and others who obviously didn't create them but were the most powerful actors, would they assist them in overcoming those handicaps, as it were, preventing that explosive cargo from going?
Of course not. Yeah.
And would those in charge of these ships of state, would they try and put out the fires, or would they be pyromaniacs? And many of those in charge recognized the problem. There were sustained serious attempts to overcome the handicaps.
Where?
Indeed, in Sudan, there was. I mean, at times in the 60s and 70s, there were efforts to have a roundtable conference in which all the citizens from all parts of the country would come together and discuss their problems. There was attempts at resolving the problems between North and South, and for 10 years there was peace. There were attempts to develop the natural resources of the country, to build institutions, to build universities, etc., etc. And this was common across Africa. So I wouldn't write off everything that happened, because there is a very rich seam of African political economic analysis that identifies these problems. And there are many examples of political leaders who recognized this and actually tried to do something about it. The problem was they were always fighting against very adverse circumstances inside and externally. And in order for them to succeed, they needed to be sustained, lucky, and often pretty decisive. Sometimes, they needed to abrogate what were considered the norms.
I think I agree. I mean, you were explaining, and what came to my head, Jafar al-Numeiri in Sudan, dictator, but then overthrown by Siwar al-Dhahab. And Siwar al-Dhahab was a good man, so he decided to do an election, and peaceful and transparent election. And you had some sort of coalition that came into power. And for a while, I mean, you see that the country is going to the right direction, but then one of the parties, Turabi, they overthrew the... So basically, I mean, there are attempts, but it doesn't work. But we talked about this, and you've written about conflicts in Sudan, and I want to ask you a feature that we see it everywhere in Africa. A lot of peace agreements, but they fail. Why?
So they don't always fail. And I think it's important to recognize that there have been many peace agreements that have lasted, that have stood. There are many wars that have indeed ended across most of southern Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, South Africa itself. There are many cases. Uganda had a peace agreement. I mean, the current government in Uganda seems determined to unravel it, but there are, so many cases where actually this has happened. Even, imperfect though they may be, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. So why do they fall apart? And they tend to fall apart each in its own particular way. So it's hard to generalize. But if we're looking at the Horn of Africa, the last round of major peacemaking efforts, which was 10 to 15 years ago, 20 years ago, across the region, the particular reason they fell apart was that they were too much trust was put in complex institutional architecture and in very heavy, expensive, multi-mandate United Nations peacekeeping operations. And not enough attention was paid to two things. One was the actual politics of how alliances were being constructed and what were the openings from moving towards more democracy. And the other, the most important factor, was neglect of finance. If these countries could not get to grips with their debt, with their chronic balance of payments crises, if they couldn't dismantle some of the illicit shadow kleptocratic economies, these peace agreements were never going to work.
So basically managing the finances and getting some aid and maybe better international structure. My last question.
But let me push back on. I mean, I think the aid is less important than the structure of the business sector. If these countries remain reliant upon sources of income that are rents, essentially from oil, from minerals,
Or aid.
or indeed aid, the business class is never going to get into real value creating, and consequently, the anchor of institutionalized civilian and democratic government, which is a business class that is anchored in the population, that's never going to develop, and you're going to see businesses taking the form of crony capitalism, clustering around those in power. And that is pretty much what we've seen.
Yeah, but so I agree with you, but personally I think that in order to have flourishing private sector and independent business owners, you need some sort of stability and just institutions, right? Trustworthy by all stakeholders within the economy. And I think for transitional countries where honest players are needed, I think that sometimes you need to be really lucky to have all these circumstances happening at the same time.
I think it's. I'm going to push back on that slightly, because I think that in countries, there are a number of countries where the commercial class has acted strategically. A great example is Somaliland.
Somaliland, yeah.
Which at the moment of its greatest instability was saved by its merchant class, who came together and said, we are not going to fund these militias. We are not going to fund this war. We are going to exclusively put our money into a government that will be accountable to the people and to us. And in Kenya, what caused Kenya to step back from the brink was that the commercial class that had been financing the political parties, when it looked as though Kenya was going over the edge 2008, said, no, we can't do this. We have to have what we call handshake politics. We have to get people back together again. Now, there was an element of corruption in that, no doubt, but it was an element that actually stabilized the country precisely because those key providers of political finance were in the country and dependent upon the functioning of that domestic economy.
That's very, very good demonstration. I want to ask you my last question. I know you short on time, and I know you have important question to settle today with the World Peace Foundation. And the question is, where do we expect the next big conflict in Africa, and how to prevent it?
So the one that I'm most fearful about is Ethiopia and Eritrea.
Eritrea?
Yeah.
Not Tigray, or together?
Well, Tigray will get engulfed in it, but Tigray is a junior actor in this. So the history of Ethiopia in the last 30 years is that there was a serious attempt to build a stable, institutionalized developmental state led by Meles Zenawi, the former prime minister. Criticized for many things, but I think as time goes by, the wisdom of his approach becomes ever more apparent. And his argument was that, and he used to say this to me, he said, it's like governing a state like Ethiopia is like running in front of an avalanche. We are on a demographic escalator, 3% growth in population every year. So that meant several million young people coming on the labor market every year under serious climate stress, in a turbulent neighborhood with some vultures circling in the Arab world. He was particularly concerned about Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. He said if they get together, then we just don't have the resources to withstand that. And he said what we need to do is we need to grow at 10% per year, And then perhaps if we achieve middle income status and we haven't had a crisis in the meantime, we will then be in a position to stabilize. And for about 20 years, Ethiopia achieved astonishing rates of growth. And a generation came up that actually began to take that for granted. And they appointed a Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, who took it for granted, who basically thought Ethiopia is destined for greatness because he didn't understand the hard work and strategy that had gone into creating that success of the developmental state. And others who, Meles died in 2012, and his immediate successors, instead of taking the real lesson of his successes, which is you need to do really sharp strategic analysis of the situation, they took what he was doing, his template of what he was doing at that moment, as doctrine, and said, we can't change this, which was completely against really what the lesson should have been. So Abiy then pursued an extraordinarily ambitious and very reckless plan, which was he assumed that you could make Ethiopia great in one great bout, and that you could overcome the democratic shortcomings by simply letting everything loose. And he couldn't manage that. And in not managing it, he led Ethiopia into a series of wars, of which the most terrible war was the war against Tigray, 2021 to 22, and dismantled the institutionalized state to replace it with what I would call a political market. And in order to keep his coalition together, and he is also another protege of the UAE. He's getting a lot of money from them. But in order to keep the sort of productive, manageable turmoil on which he thrives, he is mobilizing for a new war. And he's saber-rattling to go to war with Eritrea. For no real cogent reason. He claims he wants a port, but Ethiopia did perfectly well for 30 years without a port. And there's no reason why Ethiopia needs to possess a port in order to be secure and develop. And should he blunder into this war, it will be a war on a vast scale and plunge the entire region into another truly devastating downward spiral.
He tried to secure a port with Somaliland, right?
He did a very ambiguous sort of deal with Somaliland, the terms of which were never fully clear. In which case, and his side of the deal was that he would recognize Somaliland as a sovereign, independent country, which of course angered Somalia enormously.
Lots of countries as well.
Yeah, and others too. In return for him getting a piece of territory on the sea, which angered the Somalilanders. And so in the election, and they do have elections in Somaliland, the then president was voted out. And the deal has with it.
So basically now what looms at the horizon is Eritrea and Tigray, very big conflict in Horn of Africa. And then if you combine that with all the troubles in South Sudan, with Sudan itself, and then you will have like big black hole in Africa.
The potential for disaster is very, very real. I hope, let me give one note of hope, which is I think what happened in El Fasher, there could be a silver lining, and it's this, which is that the attack happened on the 26th of October, the day after talks broke down of the Quad in Washington. And the specific reason they broke down was that General Burhan didn't want to agree or he couldn't agree. He promised that he would agree, but he was undermined by the Islamists in his own coalition who exercised their veto. And the next day, presumably with a green light from the UAE, the RSF went in. Now, to their the devastation that is happening will, I hope, bring two groups of people to their senses. The first of all, the UAE is recognizing that there is a huge reputational cost to being associated with this type of terrible massacre, and it can pull back. And if it pulls back from the RSF, let it also pull back from its other protege, Abiy Ahmed, who is on the brink of doing something even more calamitous, and it could not do it without a UAE green light. And on the other side, Turkey and Qatar, that have been cutting a lot of slack for the Islamists, must also take responsibility for allowing their proteges to veto what would a deal that would have prevented this massacre. They didn't commit the massacre, but they could have stopped it, and they didn't. And if all those players come together, then we could have the beginnings of a pact for stability in the region.
How hopeful are you that these parties could come to their senses?
So let me put it this way. You alluded to a very important date in the calendar today, which is the World Peace Foundation was set up in 1910. It was endowed by a bequest from our founder, Edwin Ginn, whose library is the Fletcher School Ginn Library. It was alumni of the World Peace Foundation that established the Fletcher School 92 years ago. As part of his endowment, he specified that every year the trustees should meet and take a vote. And if world peace has been achieved, then the money no longer comes to the World Peace Foundation, it goes to the Charles Bank Home for the Working Women of Boston. And the vote will be taken for 2025, the 114th vote of this board, and each time in the past it's gone, no, there hasn't been world peace. And I suspect it'll be there isn't world peace, so my job will be secure for another year, but hopefully there will be at least a step towards it.
Professor Waal, thank you a lot for the insights. Thank you for your time. I learned a lot from you today, and I really hope that the world would be a better place. But I also see that human ignorance and greed dictates much of our actions.
It's been great to be on your show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.